Okay, welcome everyone and thank you for attending today's webinar on managing risk. My name's Jason Dane, I'm one of the consultants at Generative HSE, and as I said, today's topic is managing risk. I apologise for the lack of catering being lunchtime, but I guess we're spread across the country. I'm here in Queensland, so I'm an hour behind, I'd suggest the majority of people. So the topic of risk management, that's a pretty big fish to fry in a quick session. So today what I'm going to do is take time to speak about a few things that I've found to be, I guess, traps, pitfalls when dealing with managing risk in organisations. Okay, so what I'm going to do is start with a story. This was about 4 years ago. My colleagues and I were having a bit of a chat over a morning coffee at a cafe. We're discussing the day's events from the prior afternoon. We were required to go to a meeting. We were working with an organisation, and they were in the infancy stage of introducing critical risk and embedding it in the organisation. So there was a lot happening, there was a lot still to do. So the meeting was basically discussing quite a few things, but one of the people that attended the meeting was there to discuss how he could contribute to the process. He was there basically selling some software, and he didn't appear to have much of a background in risk management, but he was talking a good game. And throughout his presentation, he was speaking to how all of the risks that he had discussed and presented to us that day, he'd run through his 11 different analytics and the associated software with that. And it sounded really impressive, and me being a bit naive and not understanding a lot about software and that, I started to ask a few questions. When I asked him to explain how the analytics had applied to the current risk we were discussing, he said, "Oh, I haven't applied it to that specific one." And as I drilled down a bit further, it turned out that in fact you hadn't applied the 11 analytics that he discussed to any risk. And at the end of the day, it boiled down to it didn't have a lot of substance at all. With of implementing something like critical risk, it can be quite daunting, and when people come to with solutions, it sounds really good, you want to believe that, etc. But anyhow, that brought us to, over our chat in the morning coffee, in jest, we discussed about implementing orange discs that people could wear around their neck, on the proviso that if you wore this orange disc, you would be safe and you wouldn't incur a fatality. And bear in mind, this was just a bit of a laugh. We were just, having a bit of a dig at the other. Having said that, if people had have wore an orange disc every day since then, that site wouldn't have seen a fatality, because they've gone without a fatality that entire time. Would that have been due to people wearing an orange disc? Of course not. It'd be silly to suggest that. The point that I'm getting at there is, we can often be under the impression that things are going really well and all of our systems are really effective, and we're on top of everything, our designs meet requirements, etc. It's just important to understand, well, is that the case? Is everything really well, or is it a case that the moons haven't aligned? So that's just something to bear in mind. So if you hear me talk about an orange disc at any other stage during the presentation, that's what I'm talking about. And again, it was only a conversation in jest. Okay, we need to have systems for risk management. That goes without saying. How do we manage them so they don't manage us? Okay, so often when we are looking at solutions in regards to risk management, we need to have the things that support that. We need to have the reporting systems. we need to have the governance, we need to have a whole range of things that are required by corporates or organisations in order to be able to report and understand where they're at. One common pitfall that can arise from that is that we start to lose focus on the intent. By that I mean if we're looking at a risk of a worker falling from height, we can fall into the trap of getting so wrapped up around the reporting requirements and the systems and the software that's in place to aid us in managing that risk, that it can actually change the focus from what's important and what's critical, which is the protection of that worker and stopping that risk from occurring. But when we focus on our software and reporting requirements, that can actually take a back seat. So it's a really important thing to be mindful of. Yes, those are all very important to have all of these systems to back it up. But it should never become the main focus. So always keep your mind on the intent. That's to stop the risk actually occurring and the controls in place for that. I refer to that as not letting the tail wag the dog. So focus on the intent, not what supports it. Okay, so we have controls in place with our procedures, our work instructions, we have risk assessments, all of those things, and I don't believe in this form that we need to go into discussion around them. And I'm sure everyone does have them in place, but what I want to speak to is how do we know how effective they are? It's one thing to understand in an office environment that these are the things that we have in place, but how do we actually know that they're effective? I believe the best way of doing that is to actually go out and speak to the frontline operators. It doesn't have to be a huge, arduous, daunting task for yourself or the operators. It's simply having a chat, and they should be able to explain to you, if it's in regards to a control, what that control is, how it works, what they need to check, and etc. So if you look at the working at height issue again, you'd be speaking to a worker and they'd know that they have to have their fall protection equipment. It has to be tagged and tested. It has to be to a correct anchor point, etc. And they should be able to clearly convey that. And if they're not able to clearly convey that and it's part of their regular work, it's routine work in their routine environment, that should start to get alarm bells ringing. Okay, so what I was just speaking about there, you can also refer to that as reality gap. So the reality gap is we operate in the managerial area thinking, okay, we've got the risk assessment in place, people are aware of it, we know what our controls are, and everyone on the ground doing this task is working to this instruction. That'd be awesome, and if that was the case 100% of the time, life would be really good. But as you'd be aware, it's not always the case. There is often a reality gap that does exist in our workplaces. So if you do go out and you do find a reality gap, it's not the end of the world. Think about that you've found this out prior to an incident, that you haven't identified it as part of a causal factor. It's not part of a investigation. You've cut it off at the pass. So having identified it up front, you're able to deal with it and come up with solutions to prevent incident occurring from the gaps that you identify. Okay, and on how we identify it, surely an audit will fix it. They fix everything. Problem with audits is that they can drive behaviours. I think back to a podcast I listened to quite a while ago on HSE, and the podcast was titled "Zero Harm Was the Goal of the Titanic." Part of that podcast, the presenter spoke about the Val Reefs mining disaster, where they had a catastrophic event. They had a significant loss of life. They had a loco go through the shaft and go on top of the plat where many workers unfortunately lost their lives. One of the controls that was absent that may have prevented that because they had a post, like a stop log, that was at the entrance to the shaft that should have prevented the loco from actually entering the shaft. That particular control was actually removed earlier that day and taken up to another level because there was an audit occurring on that other level on the following shift. So audits can give you good information, but they can also give you false information. Again, that can be how they're approached too, but when people know they're being audited, it tends to give them heightened awareness, and it may not be, it will be a snapshot of what's happening at that point in time, but it may not be an accurate snapshot of what's continually happening. One of the things that I found when I was working as an operational superintendent in a mine was fresh eye approach, and looking at it, observations, not accusations. Workers can get quite jittery when they know that they're being watched. They can become nervous, feel that they're, being subject of an investigation, etc. What I found is I got people from around the mine that didn't necessarily work in the area that we were looking at. So they might have been from the mill, they may have been from up top, etc. What we'd do is get them together and have a bit of a brief on what I wanted them to look at, the area I wanted them to look at, and give them the procedures that applied to that job, and we'd come up with a bit of a list of what we wanted to look at and focus on. So they'd go down into the mine with someone that knew the area, just so they weren't going to find themselves in any unsafe areas, etc. And they would go down to a task and they'd pretty much dissect it. Because they didn't understand the task, they didn't normalise or attempt to normalise anything that they saw. They were simply looking at the task, how it was conducted versus how it was meant to be conducted according to procedures, work instructions, etc. That was really effective. Simple things like they were once speaking to a drilling operator and they were asking about the emergency stop on the drill. And because a driller, he's worked with that drill for years, he knows that's the emergency stop, he knows it's there and he knows what it does. But the people that were speaking to him on this particular occasion were they were asking, oh, okay, what's that? It's an emergency stop. What do you use that for? And throughout these questions, they actually come to the realisation that the emergency stop was not in the best location. It wasn't accessible for some of the situations in which it would have been intended to be used. As a result of that, we were able to move that emergency stop. That was one of the learnings we had come out of that, but there were many others. And fresh eyes, or as my kids like to call people that are new to things, noobs, can offer a great deal of value in situations. Again, like I said, because they don't normalise and they ask questions that people that are familiar with the task might just write off as being a more efficient way of doing something, etc. So that's a really good practice. It's very cost effective. It doesn't really cost anything other than some time. And some really good learnings can come out of that. And the majority of the times, the people that they were speaking to, the operators in the mine, the people that were actually down there engaging in the work, peers of theirs or friends that they knew from around the mine, but they didn't necessarily perceive as being a supervisor or, in a position of authority to them. So they were a lot more forthcoming with information when asked questions. So yeah, fresh ice is something to keep in the back of your mind. Okay, so moving forward. Okay, I've been doing some reading lately. There's been a lot of talk about debunking some popular myths. So two of the ones we've discussed today is unsafe acts of work as the principal causes of occupational accidents, and reducing accident frequency will equivalently reduce severe injuries. Okay, and a fair bit of the reading I've done with this was a peer-reviewed article called Reviewing Heinrich, Dislodging Two Myths from the Practice of Safety by Fred Manuel. So if we look at the first one here, the unsafe acts of workers are the principal cause of occupational accidents. And the talk there about Henrich's causation theory, which is 88-10-2 ratio. And that is 88 unsafe acts of persons, 10% are unsafe mechanical or physical conditions, and finally 2% are unpreventable. I'd like to think that most people have moved on from subscribing to this train of thought, and rather than saying it's an unsafe active person, we should rather than focusing on the person, focus on the system where the person works, and look at an unsafe act as an outcome and not necessarily a cause. If we just revert to, okay, that person was an unsafe act, we're not going to drill down as far as we need to get to root causes, etc. And it's quite easy from an investigation perspective to say human error and move on and go down the pub and pat each other on the back and say well done. Another investigation down, but it's not really adding value when we do that. Okay, and second of all, reducing accident frequency will equivalently reduce severe injuries. Okay, and they're talking here about the ratio between no loss incidents, minor incidents, and major incidents. And there's a picture there of the pyramid that helps sort of explain what they're getting at there. I've worked in an organisation where one of the assets, not the one I was at, but an asset that I was at, had a total recordable injury frequency rate of 1, and they had sat on that for quite some time. So 1, that's very low. They'd been there, I think, for over 12 months, and there's a lot of focus on, hey, these guys have really got it going on. This is awesome. And I guess there could have been, and I wasn't there, so this is purely speculative, there could have been that feeling that, hey, you know, we're all over this and things are awesome and we're pretty much invincible. So they did have the injury rate of 1. The next significant thing to happen was a fatality. So they went from not having a restricted work injury or a lost time injury over a 12-month period to having a fatality. So I guess that's a good counter argument to the ratio of no loss incidents, minor incidents and major incidents. And again, there was a company over in Western Australia that had a really impressive recordable injury frequency rate. And they'd been on that for quite some time also. And they had gone from that really low rate to having 4 fatalities within a 12-month period, and they weren't the result of one mass event. They were fatalities scattered throughout a 12-month period, and that was the company and also included contractors as well in those 4, which is quite sad. So you can see how I guess when you focus and believe that taking care of the little things, the big things will follow, isn't necessarily accurate. It could be a case of, you know, taking your eye off the ball over here can have impacts elsewhere on the track. What I'll do now, if I can get it to work, is play you a video, and as it goes through, I'll explain. It's just a little activity. I'm sure most people have seen it, but if you haven't, just follow the prompts and see how you go. Sorry, just getting back to the screen there. Okay, so I'll be honest, the first time I seen that, I didn't see the gorilla. And I don't even think I got the correct number of passes. I must have had my head in the clouds that day. But yeah, that's just a fun little thing to, have a bit of an example of when we focus on one thing and we pour all of our attention to that, what are we missing out on? So don't let our quest to drive down our recordables get in the way of preventing the bigger ticket items. You do get what you measure, but make sure that you're measuring the right things. Also, it's important to think about when we're looking at the two things from Heinrich here, that the last edition, the 4th edition of this work was done in 1959. Okay, 1959, the Sydney Opera House was just beginning to be built. Robert Menzies was the Prime Minister, and in America a card set you back $2,200. It's obviously a long time ago, and a lot has moved on. So if you still find yourself being caught up in that method of thinking, just ask yourself, that was 1959, we're nearly at 2016. So be mindful of that. Okay, and in line with moving forward in regards to risk management, it's good to see now that a lot of industries are taking on and adopting critical risk, and that flows nicely into what we're just discussing there about not focusing just on our recordables in an effort to drive them down. Critical risk is really good as it separates your low-level risk events from your serious injuries and fatalities. So it doesn't say we're going to ignore those, that we're not going to worry about those don't matter. They do matter, and we still do give them attention. However, we make sure that we focus attention to the serious injuries and fatalities, and for some businesses, significant financial loss. So critical risk is good for that. It gives you good guidance to be able to focus on those things, and when you start working with critical risk within an organisation, you work heavily with the workforce, the operators, to determine what risks are critical within the organisation, and then you can set about how you control them, what controls are required. Another good thing to do with critical risk is it doesn't necessarily focus so much on the likelihood, it's very heavily weighted on consequence. Because if it's a 1 in 100 event, you don't want to be that 1 in 100. It also, when implemented correctly, ensures that critical controls are effective and will prevent an incident. That those controls are in place, and there's a really heavy focus, when done correctly, that the operators fully understand what critical risks they're exposed to throughout the course of their work, and in line with that, what controls are required for each of those risks. And that's a very important part, because if someone is operating without a critical control in place, that ceases to exist. The control becomes absent, and if it's a critical control and it's absent, there is that potential there to see serious injury or fatality. So critical risk is really good. I'm very pleased to see how it's being implemented across a lot of different industries and organisations, and that's a work in progress. And I think as more people pick it up and share learnings, there's going to be a lot more benefit to be gained from critical risk for everyone. Okay, so we're nearly out of time. I'll allow some time for questions, but there's a couple of things that I'd like everyone to focus on, not just today, and not just because we're in the silly season leading up to Christmas and whatnot, but because of what we do and the impacts of getting it wrong. So some questions I'd just like everyone to reflect upon. First of all, are things really going well? Okay, are we not seeing any incidents, etc., because we've got really good systems, or again, is it the moons just haven't lined up? Or so controls may look good on paper, but have they changed since they were done? When were they last reviewed, etc. The controls, again, as I just spoke to, the controls understood by those that they are protecting. In line with that, are they in use? So are people aware of them? Are they using them? Another thing in regards to risk management is the systems. Okay, do we have systems that help us manage, or have we got systems that are managing us? Really important. Again, I can't talk enough about ensuring that we don't mould our controls and risk to fit system requirements. It's important that we maintain the integrity of the control and it meets its intent. And finally, I guess from the legislative perspective, do we really have all of our controls to alert? And again, just think about it. They may come up as alert when you look at it in a benign office environment, etc. Just think if there was a significant incident or accident, would you be happy to put your hand on your heart and say, yeah, I really thought that was going to do the job? So there's some questions that I've got, I guess, for you to think about. Has anyone got any questions about anything that we've discussed today? If so, feel free to type them into your screen there. Everyone must be busy eating. Okay, and I guess finally, beware of the orange disc. As I spoke about earlier at the start, things may be going well, but is that just because they're going well out of luck, or are they going well because we're really managing it and we really understand our risks and our controls are in place and effective? Okay, so if you want to continue this conversation at any stage, have a look at the Generative HSE website. It's all the W's, generativehse.com. There's also a number that you can call and you can be put into contact with myself, Mark, or any of the Generative HSE staff. And that number is 1300 392 040. And like I said, if there's anything that when you go away and have a think, feel free to contact me. More than happy to help where I can. And bear in mind, there's a lot of different, I guess, methods and ways of gaining good insights into how your organisation's working and ways you can get snapshot of the culture of your organisation. So again, if you need any assistance with that, feel free to contact any of the Generative HSE team. I'll leave it open for another minute in case any questions do pop up.